What's up, everybody? Brothers, sisters, psychonauts, and seekers of truth. It is Ananka, and welcome to my bazaar. Today, I will be reading the Norse legend, The Treasures of the Gods. This version comes from the book Viking Spirit by Daniel McCoy. With all that being said, let our story begin. Thor's wife, Sif, was admired by all for her dazzling golden hair. Loki, that incorrigible maker of mischief, sliced off all of it one day for no other reason than his delight in naughtiness. When Sif's fearsome husband found out what had happened, he flew into a rage and seized Loki, intending to break every bone in his body. But Loki pleaded with Thor, promising the thunder god that if his life were spared, he'd have the dwarves forge for Sif a head of hair made of real gold, but which would grow like real hair. Thor let the panting Loki drop to the floor and agreed to let him live on the condition that he fulfilled his promise. So Loki made his way to the subterranean home of the dwarves and found the dwelling and forge of the master craftsman Ivaldi. They took pride and care in crafting not only the golden hair, but also the ship Skid Bladnir, which was so big that it could carry all of the gods and their weapons at once, yet could be folded up and fit into a small bag, and always had a favorable wind. And the spear Gungnir, or swang, which never failed to hit its mark. Loki had accomplished his task, but he hadn't fully satisfied his itch for prankishness. So he went to the dwarf Brock, metalworker, and bet his head that Brock's famed brother Sindri, sprayer of sparks, couldn't fashion 3 objects on par with the 3 that Ivaldi and his family had just made. Brock and Sindri accepted the challenge. Sindri laid a pigskin bellows on the hearth and instructed his brother to blow into it. Sindri worked for a long time with intense concentration until a fly, who was no other than Loki in disguise, landed on his head and bit him. But the fly's interference was unsuccessful, for shortly after, Sindri lifted out of the hearth Gulin Bortsi, a stout boar whose mane and bristles were made of gold so bright that it provided light in darkness, and who could run faster and longer than any horse. Then Sindri placed a block of gold in the hearth and told Brock to keep blowing while he went out for a little while. Brock breathed into the pigskin steadfastly, but before too long, a fly buzzed around his head, settled on his neck, and bit him hard. Yet still he kept blowing, and soon Sindri returned and took out of the fire Draupnir, Dripper, a splendid arm ring from which 8 more rings of equal weight fell every 9th night. Then Sindri placed iron in the hearth, and bade his brother to blow especially carefully and steadily this time, because the project was especially sensitive, and would be spoiled if he were to falter. The fly seized his chance and stung Brock's eyelid, causing blood to flow into his eyes. Brock left his position to wipe his face and swat the fly away, which proved to be just long enough for the bellows to go flat. Sindri's face was grave, and he said that this misstep had come close to ruining the undertaking. Luckily, however, it was still salvageable, and before long, Sindri pulled a hammer out of the fire. He handed the hammer to Brock, along with the ring and the boar, and sent him off to Asgard to claim the payment they were due from Loki. When Loki and Brock both arrived in Asgard, the gods sat in council and allowed Loki to present what he had obtained first. He laid before them the shining hair, which went to Sif, the ship, which went to Frey, and the spear, which went to Odin. Then it was Brock's turn. The dwarf presented the ring to Odin, the boar to Frey, and, at last, the hammer to Thor. This hammer, the dwarf proclaimed, had abilities that rivaled those of any of the other gifts the god had received that day. Like Odin's spear, the hammer always hit its mark. Not only that, but when thrown, it would return to its owner's hand after striking its foe. Nevertheless, Brock had to admit that the hammer had a defect on account of the fly's interference. It was short in the handle. The gods decided that despite the hammer's flaw, it was the best of all of the wondrous pieces of workmanship they had been given that day, because it gave the gods their best defense against the giants. On that basis, they decreed that Brock had rightfully won his bet with Loki, and was entitled to his head. As before, Loki protested and offered to redeem himself, but the dwarf declared that the trickster had already caused enough grief, and would be given no respite. Loki then declared Brock to catch him, and took off running. He was promptly caught by Thor, however, and returned to the dwarf. Just as Brock was about to chop off Loki's head, the wily god thought of a way out at last. "I promised you my head," he admitted, and then added slyly, "but not my neck. My neck you must leave intact." Brock was enraged, but had to concede that Loki had a point. So he took an awl and string and sewed Loki's lips together, taking care to inflict as much pain as possible, which he thought a fitting vengeance for the grief Loki's words had caused him.